ráðstefna sögusettursins 1627. Þá byrði ég öll hjartanlega velkomin á þessa alþjóðlegu ráðstefnu Tyrkjaránið 1627. Ráðstefnan haldin á vegum sögusettursins og uppbyggingarsjóðs SAS og í samræmi við meginhlutverk setursins að beita sig fyrir fræðslu og sögu Vestmannaeyja. Stuðla rannsóknum, efla til ráðstefna og viðburða og standa að útgáfu efnis sem tengist sögu Vestmannaeyja. Sérstakir gestir ráðstefnunnar þessu sinni eru allir vel þekktir fyrir störf sín sem fræðimenn og rithöfundar. Þeir koma frá Íslandi, Svíþjóð, Hollandi og Bandaríkjum Norður-Ameríku. Við ráðstefnugestir fáum erinda gesta okkar að njóta veitinga í Norður-Afríku og hlýða á íslensk þjóðlög í austrænum stíl. Sigurhanna var að dreifa til punktum úr erindum þeirra sem tala á ensku, þannig að þið skiljið örugglega ensku og ráðið við það, en það eru punktar sem að þið fáið í hendurnar líka. Honored guests, on behalf of the board of the History Center 1627, I welcome you to this conference on the Barbary Crusade 1627. We are looking forward to hearing what you are going to tell us about your work on the subject related to the Crusade. Thank you all very much for your participation. Áður ég Kára Bjarnasyni stjórn þessar ráðstefnu, færa honum hana, þá langar mig fyrir nokkrum voru gefnir út minningardiskar vegna Tyrkjaránsins 1627 sem að Kolbrún S. Kjarval vann og þessi diskar eru í hennar stíl sem allir þekkja og hér er ég með 2 diska sem ég ætla að afhenda tveimur þeim sem hér koma núna og halda erindi, bæði Adam Nichols og Karl hafa fengið þessa diska áður, þannig að það eru þeir hollendingurinn og svíinn okkar sem fá diskana. Enginn þessara diska sem gefnir voru út eins, þannig að hver þeirra sig nánast einstæðni. I will now give you Mats and Joris this plate we made in memory of the Turkish raid 1627. They are every dish, every plate is a unique because no one is there is a difference in everyone. No one is the same. So because Karl and Adam has got this plate before, I will give it to you in memory of the Turkish raid. Well,
thank you very much. Thank you very much.
Yes, thank you. And to you. Yes. That's okay, thank you. Yes, what would you do? Thank you. There you are. Thank you.
That's beautiful.
Okay. Thank you.
It's a well-known Icelandic artist who made this, and only 15 pieces.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Oh, wow.
Very good. Good. Thank you. Welcome.
look like this building. Thank you very much.
Okay. Þeir sem hér eru fyrirlesurum Karl Már Hreinsson. Hann mun fjalla útgáfu og not reisubóka séra Ólafs Egilssonar. Hingað líka kominn Mats Reuter frá Svíþjóð. Hann ætlar að kynna skáldsögu vestmanniska fjölskyldu sem handtekið var í Tyrkjaránið og flutt til Alsír. Og hér svo Joris van Oos. Hann frá Hollandi og hann ætlar að fjalla sérstaklega þátt hollendinga í Tyrkjarániðinu. Og svo Adam Nichols sem kemur frá Bandaríkjunum og hann fjallar sérstaklega foringja í rásahópana þá Murat Reis og Murat Flamengo. Að svo mæltu þá bið ég Kára Bjarnason að taka við og stjórna ráðstefnunni. Gjörðu svo vel.
Já, takk fyrir þetta Ragnar. Við og velkomin á þennan síðasta dagskrárlið safnahelgar, síðasta formlega dagskrárlið safnahelgar. Sýningar og sölv eru opin til 16 eða 17 í dag, en ég hvet þá sem ekki hafa séð einstakar sýningar, sem í fiskbyggðinni, Hvíta húsinu eða gestastofunni til þess að nota tækifæri og líta þar við þegar þessum dagskrárlið lýkur. En við erum að fjalla væntanlega mesta bókmenntaafrek sem unnið hefur verið í Vestmanni. Það þessi bók hérna, reisubók séra Ólafs Egilssonar. Og við þessi félagsskapur sem stöndum að þessum dagskrárlið nefnum okkur eftir þeim atburði sem hér lýst 1627 þegar að meira en helmingur Vestmanneginga hertekinn og fluttur sem þræll í framandi heim og fjórða tug drepinn. Og það minnihluti þjóðarinnar eða samfélagsins sem skilið eftir og það ein af ráðgátum Tyrkjaránsins hvernig hægt að mynda samfélag að nýju. En að þessu sinni þá ætlum við ekki að fjalla þessa undursamlegu bók sem ég hvet alla þeirra að lesa sem ekki lesið hana því að það ekki oft að staða og hún sé framand á einhvern einasta hátt því hún tala beint í hjarta hvers einasta manns. Við ætlum að fjalla hvernig þessi bók ekki bara mikilvæg fyrir Vestmannaeyjar, ekki bara mikilvæg fyrir Ísland, heldur leggur fram mikilvægan skerf fyrir heiminn allan. Það nú oft sagt að þeir sem tala fyrir hönd Vestmannaeyja, eins og ég gerir núna, þeir fari með himinskautum og það má vel vera rétt í mörgum tilvikum, en að þessu leyti þegar að borið lof á reisubókina, þá aldrei of mælt. Það kom mér alveg gríðarlega óvart að kynnast þeim önnum sem eru hérna. Það fyrst Karl Smári og Adam Nichols. Þeir hafa nú lagt heiminn undir reisubókina, getum við sagt. Þýtt hann á ensku eins og þið þekkið. Og getum við sagt fjórar útgáfur Karl Smári.
Og tvær á leiðinni.
Þakkaði fyrir. Og það opnaði augu fræðimanna fyrir þessum einstakt arfi. Og þeir sem eru eldri í sögusetrun eins og Helga Hallbergs og fleiri, það að segja eldri í félagatölu sögusetursins, ég ekki að draga hana fram sem eldri smæl, heldur muniði með Sigurði Vilhelmsson og fleirum munið þegar vorum að kynna reisubókina alveg fyrst, 2007 eða hvað það var. Hvað þessir erlendu fræðimenn sem komu voru hissa reisubókin væri til. Nú eru miklu færri hissa vegna þess að hún orðin viðurkenndur viðurkenndur öll í heimsbókmenntunum að þeir leyti sem að fjalla þessa hörmulegu heim sem þræla haldið í Norður Afríku eða Ottoman-veldinu var. En við ætlum að hafa háttina á þannig að það koma 2 fyrirlesarar hér fyrst. Karl Smári, hann ætlar eins og Ragnar fór yfir að ræða það hvernig við höfum, hvernig útgáfan sjálf hefur verið sett á önnur tungumál og hvernig menn hafa verið að nýta sér þennan vitnisburð, þennan samtíma vitnisburð, samtíma heimild. Mats Fjölþjóðleg, hann gaf út fallega bók sem hérna til sölu, sem fjallar vestmanníska fjölskyldu, eins og Ragnar rakti, sem hægt ekki flutt til alls. Og hann mun gera okkur grein fyrir þessari bók, hún til sölu hérna, hún til meður ekki íslensku, heldur á sænsku, þannig að hann kannski dreifur úr að menn fara að lesa hana, en hann var yfir hana. Og þegar að þessi 2 hafa lokið sér af, þá kemur tríó Ásgeirssonar sem þeir hafa verið að útsetja íslensk þjóðlög með svona austræn lífvafi, en þeir fara betur yfir það hjá sér. Svo koma aðrir 2 fyrirlesar sem eru þá, sem ég kynni það bara þegar að því kemur, og þegar að þeir hafa lokið sér af, þá lýkur tríóið sínum með framlagi. Þannig að ég ætla að biðja bara Karl Smárum að koma og við og vaðið og flytja okkur sína tölu og ræða aðeins þessa fallegu bók hérna og þann mann sem stendur á bak við þetta Fjölþjóðleg. Takk.
Já, komið öll þær. Ég ætla ekki að vera mjög langvarður, en það fara aðeins yfir sögu reisubókarinnar fyrst. Þegar sér Ólafur Einarsson kemur aftur frá Barbarínu 1628, þá mjög fljótlega eftir það, þá er hann líklega beðinn að skrifa reisubókina. Því hann segir það strax í formála að hann hafi gert það á veggjan. Það hlýtur eiginlega að vera það eiginlega hefur verið Oddur Einarsson biskup í Skálholti. Vegna þess að sér Ólafur, hann fer í Skálholt skömmu eftir hann kemur úr sinni píslargöngu og hittir Skálholtsbiskups, hann var náttúrulega undirmaður hans í raun og veru, og ég tel það nokkurn veginn lýst að það hafi verið biskupinn sjálfur sem að bað hann að skrifa reisubókina. Af reisubókinu eru núna til það bil 30 handrit. Og þau eru flest frá 18. öld, jafnvel frá 19. öld. Eins og þið vitið þá voru ekki gefnar út bækur á Íslandi nema guðsorðabækur og náttúrulega lagabækur eða búskap eða eitthvað slíkt. Veraldlega bækur voru yfirleitt ekki gefnar út á Íslandi fyrir bara á 19. öld. Ekki niður marki. En reisubókin hefur náttúrulega sérstöðu vegna þess að strax 1741 þá er hún þýdd á dönsku og kemur út á dönsku. Þetta er mjög merkilegt vegna þess að árið 1741 þá voru engar bækur sem að teljast það er að segja reisubókbækur eða bókmyndir þýddar á dönsku, ekki nema þá bara Íslendingasögur eða eitthvað slíkt. En reisubókin sem er nánast samtíma bók, þó að það hefur verið 120 árum seinna, hún er þýdd yfir á dönsku og hún er gefin út á dönsku og hún er endurútgefin árið 1800. Síðan er það ekki fyrir 1852 að bókin kemur út á íslensku, reisubókin, í afar lélegri útgáfu. Og svo útgáfa telst nánast bara ekki með útgáfu. Síðan er það 1906–1909 að Sögufélagið gefur út reisubókina og allt tiltakt efni sem að tengist Tyrkjaránið. Þannig afar vönduð og góð útgáfa Jóns Þorkelssonar. 1969 þá var sú útgáfa af reisubókinni ein útgáfan, eitt handritið, endurútgefið af AB. Og Sverrir hvað var hann, Kristjánsson, sá þá útgáfu og skrifaði mjög skemmtilegan og fróðlegan formála að þeirri bók, þeirri íslensku útgáfu. Það svo ekki fyrir bara núna á síðasta ári að það kemur út ný útgáfa af reisubókinni á íslensku. Reisubókin var algjörlega óþekkt erlendum fræðimönnum þar til við Adam Nichols gáum út þýddum reisubókinu á ensku og hún var gefin út af Fjölþjóðleg bókaútgáfu árið 2008. Reyndar hafði bandarískur fræðimaður skrifað grein árið 1973, Dr. Bernard Lewis í Stanford háskóla í Bandaríkjunum, sem var einn fremsti fræðimaður heims á sviði átaka á milli hins múslimska heim og hins kristna heims. Hann hafði kynnt sér reisubókina og í gegnum danska þýðingu og minnist á hana í grein, sem sagt í tímariti árið 1973. Það líklega fyrsti erlendi fræðimaður sem fjallaði reisubókina. Jæja, við gefum út reisubókina árið 2008 og rétt á eftir þá fór í þrot, var gjaldþrota. Ég tók við þrotabúinu, eða reisubókinu, þar sem var óselt. Bókin seldist mjög vel, hún var endurútgefin 2011, 2014 og 2016 þá var hún gefin út af bandarískum háskóla, The Catholic University of America, hvorki meira en minna í Washington. Og það er svona frekar fræðileg útgáfa, kölluð semi-akademísk. Og hún hefur selst mjög víða, til sölu á Amazon, hefur fengið mjög góðar viðtökur. Það var einmitt þar sem að Mats Reuter náði í eintak af reisubókinu, það var bara Amazon. Síðan endurútgáfið við reisubókina 2018 á ensku, svona ný þýðing. Þetta sem sagt okkar vinna af reisubókinu, okkar aðtons. En þessar útgáfur okkar á ensku hafa orðið til þess að það hafa verið gefnar út sögulega skáldsögur. Áður en við þýddum okkar bók, þá hafði Steinunn Jóhannesdóttir skrifað sína reisubók Guðríðar. Úlfar Þormóðsson hafði gefið út 2 bækur sögulega skáldsögur sem byggja á reisubókinni. Það Rauð mold og Hnatandi jörð. Það var skemmtilega bækur. Nú, það má ekki gleyma Jóni Helgasyni sem skrifaði sögulega frásögn af reisubókinni, af Tyrkjaráninu, sem ekki sögulega skáldsaga, það var skemmtileg bók. Nú, Sagnaseiður, bók eftir Sally Magnússon, dóttur Magnúsar Magnússonar, var skáldsaga og hún byggir á okkar þýðingu á reisubókinni. Gaf hann fyrst út á ensku, The Sealswoman's Gift. Hugmyndin að þeim titli komin út af sögunni selkonuna sem átti 7 börn á landi og 7 börn í sjó. Eins og ég sagði, þessi bók er þýdd á íslensku og heitir Sagnaseiður. Síðan rekst Mats Reuter á reisubókinni eins og ég sagði og hann skrifar sína skáldsögur byggða á reisubók sér Ólafs. Þetta eru þær skáldsögur sem byggja á reisubókinni, en ég ætla aðeins að nefna hérna að nokkrar fræðilegar útgáfur af reisubókinni. Strax 1643 þá skrifar Björn Jónsson á Skarsá í Skagafirði, hann skrifar Tyrkjaráns sögu. Það er að segja hann tekur reisubók sér Ólafs og 3 önnur verk. Frásögn Klaus Eyjólfssonar og síðan Einars Lofssonar hérna í Vestmannaeyjum og Halldórs hertekna í Grindavík. Þessi bréf þeirra eru glötuð, en við þekkjum þeirra frásögn af Tyrkjaráns sögu Björns á Skarsá. Hún er gefin út miðja 19. öld á íslensku og hefur ekkert verið endurútgefin. Þessi frásögn Björns á Skarsá er mjög merkileg og ágætt og hérna ég vil nefna að við Adam erum nú að vinna að enskri þýðingu á þessari Tyrkjaráns sögu fyrir Cornell háskóla í Bandaríkjunum í Íþaka. Þar sem þetta fræga safn Fiske Collection, það vil segja bókasafn, bóka- og handritasafn Willard Fiske er geymt. Það hefur löngum verið íslenskur fræðimaður, bókavörður og við erum í sambandi við þann fræðimann, þann bókavörð, við Adam og við hyggjumst gefa út Tyrkjaránið sögu á ensku, annars vegar textan, íslenska textan, hins vegar enska textan sem við erum að vinna. Ég vil nefna líka að, ef ég nefni fleiri fræðibækur, að Þorsteinn Helgason, sagnfræðingur við Háskóla Íslands, hann skrifaði sína doktorsritgerð Tyrkjaránið, minni Tyrkjaránsins og svo bók sem kom út fyrir hátt í 10 árum síðan, var síðan gefin út á ensku fyrir nokkrum árum og heitir að við minnir The Longest Voyage. Það er að segja lengsta ferðin. Sú bók var gefin út á hollensku forlagi, en nánast ekki gefin út fyrir almenning. Þetta forlag sérhæfis í að útvega bara fyrir fræðimenn og söfn. En það kostar bókinn 18.000 krónur. Þannig hún er ekki aðgengileg beint almenningi svo bók, en ágættis Þorsteinn er virtur og góður fræðimaður. Í Hollandi er fræðimaður sem heitir, nú veit ég bara ekki hvernig að bera það fram, frekar en Schimpholt, það er Arne Sudok, Arne Hann hefur skrifað gríðarlega mikið sjóræningja og bara hreint alfræði rit, bara geysistórt alfræði rit, og hann skrifaði, það var gefin út núna á þessu ári, þá kom út bók Jan Jansson, admirál frá Saleh, admirál í Saleh í Marokko, 17. aldar muslimsku sjóræningi frá Harlem í Hollandi. Það er sjóræningi sem rændi í Grindavík. Og formála af þessari mjög merkilegu og skemmtilegu bók er Adam Nichols og Joris Van Os sem hér sitja. Þetta er mjög skemmtilegu útgáfa og það er sami útgefandi og gaf út reisubóksir Ólafs Egilssonar á hollensku fyrir 3 árum. Það er að segja hollenska þýðingu á okkar verk okkar Adam. Þannig að hollendingar eru farnir að sína Tyrkjaráninu Vestmannaeyjum verulegan áhuga og það er jafnvel stendur til að þýða fleiri bækur í þessari ritröð sem að snerta Tyrkjaráninu Íslandi og gefa það út í Hollandi. Í Noregi er maður ákaflega merkilegu fræðimaður, Torbjörn Böðigård, sem hefur í meir en 20 ár, kannski 30 ár, ég veit það ekki, fjölda mörg ár, unnið að rannsóknum á Tyrkjaránum og bara í Evrópu og hann hefur farið margar ferðir til Marokko og Norður-Afríku og rannsakað farið þær í öll mögulegu og ómögulegu söfn og líka í Hollandi og Norðurlöndum og hann hefur gefið út núna stórt 2 binda verk þessa sjóræningastarfsemi og 3. bókin kom út fyrir fáum árum. Þetta er alveg gríðarlega mikið verk. Og hann styðst við verk okkar Adamsdáliti, hann styðst við reisubóksir Ólafs Egilssonar í sínu verki. En því miður þá gat Torbjörn ekki komið hingað núna og hann er sjálfstæður fræðimaður. Kári Bjarnason, fyrst hann nú farin og heyrir ekki hvað segja, hann hefur greitt götu Torbjörns. Hann hefur greitt götu hans með því að kaupa til safnsins allmörg eintök af þessum verki. Torbjörn er sjálfstæður fræðimaður og hefur átt erfitt uppdráttar í þessu fræðarsamfélagi einhverja hluta vegna. En alveg gríðarlega áhugasamur. Hann hefur komið hingað til Vestmannaeyja, hann var hér á ráðstefnu 2008. Hans framlag er mjög merkilegt. Það sem ég hefði viljað nefna meira er að ég þarf ekki að fjölyrða bók Kára Bjarnasonar og Más Jónssonar professors í sagnfræði. Þessa bók sem kom út hérna í fyrra. Það er náttúrulega mikið merkilegt og gott að fá þessa bók endurútgefna. Fá hann útgefna núna. Hún var ekki gefin út af sama handriti og bókinn sem Sögurfélagið gefið út 1906-1909. Þetta handrit gengt í skóum hjá honum Þórði. Annað handrit, þetta eru 2 handrit. Svo vil ég nefna að við Adam, og það ekki síður Adam en ég, við skrifum grein í Sjónvarpsblað Grindavíkur fyrir 3 árum og Hallur Gunnarsson, forstöðumaður minni á Sögufélags Grindavíkur, hann hringdi í mig og sagði ég vil fá bók Tyrkjaránið í Grindavík. Ég útfæra peningarna sinna. Og það var ekkert mann að ræða, hann vildi náttúrulega fá bók íslensku og ég sagði við eigum tölvöld mikið efni á ensku Tyrkjaránið í Grindavík, sérstaklega Adam þar sem hann verið að rannsaka Jan Sú frá Harlandi. Og við tókum okkur til og Grindavíkur bær styrkti útgáfuna myndarlega og fyrir rúmu 1,5 ári þá kom út bókin Northern Captives sem fjallar Tyrkjaránið í Grindavík og afdrif fólksins sem að flutt var til Sami í Marokko og selt það. Það voru eitthvað ekki mjög margir Íslendingar en þetta voru kannski 30-40 manns alls ef við tökum alla Danina og Englendingana sem rættu. Og þetta fyrsta bókin sem fjallar Tyrkjaránið í Grindavík. Skrifuð ensku, en það stendur til að skrifa hana á íslensku. Í framhaldi af því að þessi bók kom út, þá hafði ég samband við Kára Bjarnason og hans fólk og spurði hvort það væri það ekki bara lagið þá beinast við að við skrifum sögu Tyrkjaránsins í Vestmanni á ensku. Og þessi bók kom út núna fyrir nokkrum mánuðum í sumar, Stolen Lives. Hefur fengið mjög góða viðtökur og hugsun eftir að hún verður líka þýdd á íslensku, vonandi. Nú, bók, hugmynd kveikist af hugmynd, bók kveikist af bók, eins og segir. Og það er einmitt það sem að gerast að nýlega birtist grein í Laði hér, einhverju fréttablöðum, að Sagafilm, kvikmyndafyrirtæki, hefði áhuga á að gefa þáttaröð Tyrkjarán og heimildarmynd, ansvarmynd Tyrkjarán og vinnuheiti þessara seríu Salem, semst í Marokko og fjallar dóttur og móður og afdrif þeirra og ástur og örlur og hefnd og allan pakkan. Og mér sýnist bara öll að hún byggir á sama hugmyndin og þessi bók hérna, Northern Captives. Þannig að áhugi á Tyrkjaráninu er orðin gríðarlegu víða. Það hafa margir fræðimenn víða. Við höfum frétt af þessu á Ítalíu, það er ítalskur fræðimaður sem hefur skrifað í grein vegna útkomu reisubókarinnar. Ferðir Ólafs á Ítalíu, hollensku fræðimaður skrifaði ferðir Ólafs í Hollandi fyrir 10 árum. Og svo mætti lengi telja. Er ég ekki bara að bæða út á tíma?
Nei.
Jæja. En, þannig að ég tel að séra Ólafur hafi, þetta er eins og kom fram hérna í innganginum, að séra Ólafur Eiríksson er ykkar og okkar merkasti einstaklingur hér og hans bók er alveg stórmerkileg vegna þess að á reisubók séra Ólafs Eiríksson hvílir meira og minna allt þetta starf. Allt saman. Það er ítarlegasta heimildin og það er ekki aðeins heimild Tyrkjaránið sjálf. Þetta er saga einstaklings gagnvart óyfirstíganlegum erfiðleikum. Hann er rændur öllu og hann fer í gegnum Evrópu í 30 ára stríðinu, nánast bara á puttanum, alls laus, kemur hingað heim og skrifa sína hörmungar sögur. Ég átti samtal við biskupinn í Skálholti, ykkar fyrir sóknarprest, hérna fyrir 1,5 ári. Ég gaf honum eintak af reisubókinni. Ég sagði við hann, þegar ég hitt hann á tröppunum í Skálholti, að ég væri að afhenda honum reisubókina. Þetta væri það fyrir 400 árum eftir að séra Ólafur afhendi biskupinn í Skálholti sína reisubók. Það hefur ósköp lítið breyst á þessum tíma. Biskupinn væri enn í Skálholti, reisubókin væri enn til Og við ræddum lengi saman við Kristján ég sagði svo við hann líklega hefur sér Ólafur skrifað þetta vegna þess að hann hefur orðið hundleiður á öllum þessum spurningum. Hvað sástu, hvað gerðist? Þannig við skrifa hana líka þess vegna þegar hann skrifa þetta frá sér. Það sagði þetta svona hálfgerðu gríni. Þá sagði sér Kristján við spátti merkilegt. Þannig að það gerði þeirra grein fyrir því að sér Ólafur, hann var búinn að missa vinnuna. Það var búið að ráða þarna tengdarsonans prest í Vestmannaeyjum. Hann var atvinnulaus. Hann þurfti nú aðeins að, líkur við að segja smjáða fyrir biskupnum, hann þurfti nú svona aðeins að láta hann vita að hann hefði ekki kastað sínu trú og gefa honum skýrslu og svona. Kanski. Þetta er nefnilega svolítið áhugavert. Sér Ólafur var atvinnulaus þegar hann kom frá þáttan að gera. Hann gæti ekki sótt maður og 70 sátti. Og hann var hreinlega að gera biskupnum grein fyrir því að hann hélt í sína trú og hann hafi hugsað sín sóknarbörn í blíðu og stríðu í eigum og áfram í jörðu. Auðvitað þetta hugleiðingar. En það má velta ýmsu fyrir sér. Svo ætla ég að nefna eitt að lokum. Ég efast að það sé nokkur bók nema það hugsanlega Njála sem að Íslendingar hafa raun og veru sem hefur kveikt margar hugmyndir fræðimanna, rithöfunda, fræðimanna allan heim eins og reisubókstir og eins og við vitum Íslendingar alveg með Njálu á heimann, það er alltaf Njála. En reisubókin, ég gæti vel trúa því að það væri engin annar bókin á Njála sem hefur verið gefin jafn oft út, hefur farið jafn víða og kveikt jafn mikinn áhuga á sögum. Og ég læt einhvern annan það. Ég hef nú bara ekki meira að segja en gef bara næsta manni orðið.
Okay, pleased to meet you, all of you. My Icelandic is not very good, so we have to take this in English. And I've written a book, Tyrkjaránið. That is the Swedish name, this famous event, 1627. And you probably recognize where the picture is taken. Maybe some heavy rocks on the back as well. It's just that that boat there, it wasn't there when the picture was taken. Makes it a bit more exciting. Okay. My name is Mats Ströker, as I said there. And I learned to sail during this time as well, which was good, because then I got to sail terminological right as well. I have a boat now in Lake Vänern. That's the largest lake in Europe outside Russia, in the middle of Sweden. So I sailed around there. They have a few thousand islands as well, so it's a nice place to sail. And that was, so I have a better understanding now. Perhaps I wouldn't have started to write this book if I had started to sail first, because then I would have understood how difficult the trip would be. Because this is a trip about a man who sails a small boat after he sails North Africa. And I'm originally an engineering physicist from Göteborg, west coast of Sweden. And I worked in product development for many years in Sweden, South Africa, Australia. Development both in telecommunication, cables, radar, rock drill rigs, welding machines, all different kind of things I've developed for. But then I started to understand now that, start to think that there were books that had to be written. So I felt the responsibility to write the books that no one else wrote. So I had to work less with the things I worked with, and start writing books. And because I know more about me is that my interest in herpetology is shown in my books as well. Reptiles and amphibians. There are not so many in Iceland, as you know, but they are in Africa. And so I have the reason for writing books is that there's normally one side to the story that media focuses on. But in the real world, there's more than one side to the story. So if you, for example, as you know, slavery was abolished late in Africa. They came, but you still only focus on the transatlantic slave trade that normally took place in the United States. That seems to be the main focus. Everyone knows about that. The black people who worked on the cotton plantations in the southern states in the United States. But in Morocco, for example, slavery was only abolished in the 1930s. When I approached the Sultan there in the 1880s, and said that you have to abolish slavery, he didn't really understand what they were talking about. I thought the idea was very strange. So, and also the other thing is that I write books about with a different perspective. My first book was In Bortom, was about discrimination of white people after apartheid in South Africa. Everyone knows that apartheid discriminated black people, but not so many knows what has happened after apartheid. That was the first book. I thought no one wrote about that, so I had to write a book about that. And particularly in this book, is that slavery, as you can see, that can affect anyone if they're not lucky. And also the reason was that it happened in a Nordic country with a culture similar to Sweden. And when I started to look into this, I noticed also that there were some people, even affected Swedish sailors, for example, that were taking slaves in the Mediterranean. And so I came across this event by coincidence. It was mentioned in a historical magazine in Sweden. And since I always try to get up with another perspective, I had two choices then. What would be the next book after the South African book? I thought this was one alternative. And the other alternative was, I was thinking about was, they talk about men's violence against women, so I thought perhaps I should write about women's violence against men. So that was also an alternative then. But when I checked around, I thought there would be greater interest in this book about the Turkish raid. So I decided to write that first, anyway. So it became my second novel. And but I had to understand it then. What was written, what was understood about this. And the interesting thing there was a book written about this event a long time ago by Olafur Egerson. And when I was thinking about this 2014, I could see that there was an English translation of this book. So I ordered it, borrowed it at Uppsala University Library. They sent me a copy. And I copied that copy as I had it. Because I wasn't able to buy the book at that time, it was sold out. So when a new book came, 2016, I bought that immediately then. Because it was easy to read from the book, I thought. I find everything. So the preparations for this was that I also had to come to Heimat. I was here in September 2014. Then I brought a car and traveled around. Så det satt var stor höftig and tried to understand where the Turks landed. And also having an idea about the spectacular cliffs around where the people were trying to hide from the Turkish slave raiders. And also this about, I read about, I had a warning from the Grindavik attack. I have an even more understanding after I read these Northern Captives and Stolen Lives, but they were not available when I wrote my novel. Because they knew that there would be slave traders that came here, they were warned about that. They didn't know about that in Grindavik. They thought that was just like the English that came a few years before, just taking goods. But here they were actually taking people. So that was a shock in Grindavik, I understand now. But here they knew about that risk that they would be brought as slaves. So they were desperately trying to get away when the Turks came. So then I knew that the Turks were different to the English criminals. They were taking people, not only goods. So the preparation was I came here, understood what the island looked like, and I went up a bit up by the Himakletur there, but I understand there were some other rocks that were even more difficult to climb, that they were hiding. And I went to the Vasa Museum. That was a unique place because this boat is contemporary, basically, to the boats that corsairs used. This sank on this Virgin tour in 1628. So it was very interesting to be there. And I'm sorry about this, I just want to have everything. Okay. So the Vasa Museum, they also had the feeling, you had a feeling for the whole ship. It's unique. And it is unique because you don't have the sea worms in the Baltic Sea. If you come out on the west coast in Sweden, there are no preserved ships because they're eaten by the sea worms. So in the Baltic Sea, you have a number of preserved ships. But it's an extreme project to bring everything up to the surface like that. So it's at the kind of museum, and it's quite a large ship. It was brought up in 1961, I think. And then it has become a museum, and all the artifacts, you can see, walk around there and see all the porcelain and everything else that is preserved from that time, that they used during the, so you get a good feeling, but it was incorrectly designed ship. You might have heard about it, that it toppled over because center of gravity wasn't correctly placed on the ship. And so I recommend the Vasa Museum if you go to Stockholm. Then you have a feeling for that kind of ship. And it's unique. You don't find a ship anywhere else in the world that is that old. I also read some literature. The main literature that I want to point out is that I want to understand the concept here of slavery. So I read the last 3-volume books by Nick Harrison about slavery. It takes care of everything from Babylon, 500 BC, to Lebanon in the 1990s. It's been a long sad story of slavery. So I could understand the context of my particular book. And also read this Tinnis Wood that specializes in Pirates of Barbary. And of course I had Olafur Egilsson's book. This is I think this is the issue from 2016 you see here. Yes, in notes here. They recognize all the different issues. Yes. And afterwards I have received the latest issue as well from Cosmore, who came to send me one. And also I had an idea from Olafur Egilsson as well, because there were some letters that were sent back. So in one of my chapters, the new priest, he reads aloud some letters from the captives in the church, and then try to get some help, some ransom money collected in the church as well, because they're desperate to free their relatives there. And they also hear about some people being killed and dying on the ships, for example. So I got an idea there about the letters, so I've introduced it into my novel as well. And this is what basically is said on the back of the text on the back. We are following a man, Arman, who is hiding on top of one of the rocks here, rock. And he looks down and he sees that his two little sons are killed by the Turks because they're used too small. And his wife and daughter, of more interest, are brought with to slavery in North Africa. And then, half the house was burnt down, so he shares a house, then his house, with another couple who has had their house burnt down. He's a sheep farmer, but he has been out sailing a lot, and when he was a kid, he borrows a boat from his friend Bjorn, who he shares with, and Bjorn takes care of the sheep while he's away. In my book. Yeah. And so because he decides then to pull himself together, he has to do this. He can't just stay and wait. So he prepares a small boat and sails after the corsairs south. He doesn't really know from the beginning where he's going. He decides to follow the ship. They are, of course, far ahead, so he doesn't find them on the way. There is similitude. It's an interesting concept. That's one I came across when I studied theoretical philosophy. So, what is true? What is not true? It is, it's a fictional story. It's based on a real event. I'm trying to stay as close to the historical event as I know. Most people are inventing in this. And I have Olafur Egilsson mentioned in my book as well. He's one of the ships, one of the ships. So he's a peripheral figure in my novel here, more, I would say. And the way I understood it at that time was that Murad Reis was on the Algerian ships, because the way I understood it was that he had moved his whole operation to Algeria in 1627, and to be able to do that, he had to be on these ships. But there are other thoughts about that, I understand that. And so the only real characters in my book are Murad and Olafur. But the interesting thing about writing an historical novel is that there's so many things you have to understand. It's, for example, I thought that he was going to miss the northern lights, the green lights, etc. But then I realized at that time, about 100 years, there was no solar activity. So they wouldn't have seen much northern lights during his lifetime. The little things like that is interesting when you write historical novels, isn't it? And also have to try to understand the borders of the time. And the route is slightly different. This is the map from Stolen Lives. I think from that was sent by Adam Nichols here. And this is the traditional Corsair route. I didn't have that map at the time when I wrote my book. So Arman followed this route. He went straight through down there. So it was a very dangerous route to understand now. He passed the rock wall. It's a great granite rock in the middle of the Atlantic, northwest of Ireland. And then I went into Ireland all the way. And it's also interesting when you have to meet different people and understand that they are not able to communicate with each other. So there have to be lots of body language in the book when they're talking. Because they spoke totally different languages. And he also went into the coast of Western France, Bretagne, and into the Bay of Biscay. And there was, in the 1600s, there was a sand, also interesting, because there was a sandy island there in the Bay of Biscay. It doesn't exist anymore, because the sand has moved inland and become part of the beach. So, and you also have to learn, he came to Lisbon, and Lisbon, there was a major point there, because then he met some Swedish sailors that had been freed. And they said that he should search in Algiers. He's probably in Algiers. Most are taken to Algiers. So the likelihood is that they will be there. And Lisbon, I also had to understand how it was then. This was before the earthquake of 1755. Can I talk too much? No. Earthquake of 1755. Then you think, what will happen? Will he reach Algiers? Will he find Björk and Brunhildur? And you have to read the book and find out about that. This is said about the book. This is a professor in history at Lund University who enjoyed the book, and he also said that he wrote in Swedish, but I translated it into English here. Basically, what he said that he thought it was a very important book, because this is an event that basically no one knows about in Sweden. So I thought it was very good that they had written it, so more people get to know about the event. And he is the most well-known historian in Sweden. Basically, he's the one who wrote these 3 volumes about slavery. He has written about 100 books, besides his full-time professorship at the university. And he's very active in journalism, TV and radio, etc. as well. So he probably doesn't sleep much. Okay. I thought perhaps I should read a short piece as well from the book. If you start, the book starts just after the raid. I thought actually first to have the raids included. First version I wrote was the raids included. First they came to the Eastern Fjords, and then they came into Heimar. And I had the raids described, but then I cut out, then I planted it in their memories instead. So when the 2 women, for example, Björk from Heimar och Frida from the Eastern Fjords, they discuss talk on the boat together, and then they discuss what happened to them. Then you find out anyway what had happened. Frida's had also children killed, for example, and they were disconnected from the husband, and they don't really know what had happened to them. And okay, I read first then in Swedish, then I read my English translation. This is the how the book starts. Arman hade inte kunnat sova sedan gruvliga händelsen. När han slöt ögonen blandades piraternas vrål med skriken hos dem som brändes inne. Det hade gått en vecka sedan den ödesdigra dagen då korsarerna anföll. Efter det var ingen saliv på hemmen. Högar av färsk jord hade kastats över varje grav och små träkors var hopspikade och nedstuckna i marken. De som fanns kvar på ön hade svåra samvetskval för att de fortfarande levde och dessutom själva hade lyckats undgå att bli förslavade. In English, Arman had not been able to sleep since that dreadful event. When he closed his eyes, the roars of the pirates were mixed with the screams of the people being burned alive in their homes. 1 week had passed since the fatal day when the corsairs attacked. Mounds of fresh soil had been piled on his grave, and small wooden crosses had been nailed together and pushed into the ground. The people remained on the island, suffered from severe qualms of conscience for still being alive, and on top of that, had evaded slavery. That's more or less what I was going to do. Okay, thank you.
Hello, dear friends, and thank you for inviting us. I'm going to try to do this in English, although my English is not 100%, but please forgive me in advance. So thank you. This is my trio. My name is Asker Askesson. This is Þorgrímur Jónsson and Eric Quick. Give them a good hand. So I think it was very appropriate to start this gig by an Icelandic guy playing a Turkish oud. This is a Turkish oud, and they've been playing this thing in the Middle East for 5,000 years. There are pictures from Egypt from 3000 BC playing this kind of instrument. So this is like the grandfather of the guitar as we know it, because this is the father of the European lute, which looks exactly the same, although it has frets in here. So, and this is the lute, the difference between the European lute and the Arabic and Turkish oud is that they have these little tones in between, the microtones. They have more tones than in the Western system. In the Western system we have 12 tones, but in the Turkish system they have like 19 tones, and in the Arabic system they have similar amount of tones, so they have more tones. So these are the strange tones we hear when we hear Arabic music or Turkish music. And even in Greek music, they sing and play these tones. Because Greek, Macedonian, Bulgarian music is very connected to the Ottoman style of playing. So we started out by playing a medley of 2 songs. The first melody I played was from a song which is Turkish song, which is called Üsküdar, which is a neighborhood or a district in Istanbul, which is on the Asian side. And the other one is called Ólafur reið með Björnfram, which is an Icelandic folk song, which you can hear. And I've been working for the past 5 years on a project, which I will tell you more about later, about a project where I've taken my own heritage to Bulgaria, Turkey, Iran, and to the Middle East, and recorded with musicians there. And Ólafur reið með Björnfram was my version of that folk song. I've added a couple of extra melodies and to make it even bigger. So this is what you heard. This is from the first album, which is called Two Sides of Europe. I might tell you just a short version of how we got here, because these guys are involved with what we've been doing here in Iceland. We've been introducing Icelanders to Eastern European and Arabic Turkish music for more than 10 years now. I started to go to Bulgaria in 2010, studying Bulgarian music, later to Greece, Turkey, many times to Turkey, Iran, and to Egypt, Morocco, and many other places. So this is not something we started yesterday. And if you have more questions after the gig, please, feel free to ask. We're going to do my version of a very famous song, which is called Grimmisvæði Klettagjá. If I find the pick, the right pick, they have very strange pick for these woods, which they call risha, and originally it's made from a horn of a goat. So it's like this, but of course today it's made of plastic. But hopefully in the future something else. So we're going to do Grimmisvæði Klettagjá, played in a kind of Bulgarian style, in a time signature which is called 7/8, on a Bulgarian tambura, of course. I think it's
þá hafið þetta eins og síðar, það er að segja, fyrst kemur þá Jóres, kvikmyndagerðarmaður og þýðandi, og hann spjallar svona þátt hollendinga í ránunum. Og lokatóninn, hann slær Alfred Nichols, háskólakennari, og sá sem er nú svona þessi stóri, hvað við segja, þessi aðdokkur maður. Ég kom nú með Karli Smára og Halldóri B. Vestmannaeyjar, þar sem það var einhvern veginn jafn auðvelt að kveikja og slökkva á vandan og fyrir þig, Halldór, að kveikja og slökkva á kvikmyndavél. Það var alveg ótrúlegt að hlusta á hvernig hann stóð þessar þar sem að segjum bara sengur konunstein og svo bara kveiktu þeir og slökktu saman. Halldór verðinni og Adam og sjálfum sig. Og svo bara var slökkt. Ótrúlegt hvað maðurinn gat þess að hann bara var tilbúinn að tala og svo bara hætta. Þegar hann gæti opnað, bara hann gæti byrjað og talað Tyrkjaránið, hvað sem var, hvenær sem var og út frá hvaða vinkli sem var. Þannig að hann verðist vera, það ekki Karlsmóður, má maður ekki segja að það er heltekinn af Tyrkjaránið.
Mörg ár.
Já, mörg ár. Þannig að og síðan þegar þeir eru búinir þá kemur tríó Ásgeirs aftur og loka dæminu og svo biðið ykkur að hjálpa okkur svo við sittum í gjörðlustu á morgunin hérna í Safnahúsinu með þessar veitingar eða þið hjálpa okkur við að reyna að klára þetta. En við opnum það líka fyrir spurningar, það kannski hérna í lokin. And please, Joris, if you would start, and then Adam Nichols, if you would just came right after that. And then we yeah, okay, please. And we open for questions. Thank you.
Hello, thank you for having me here. Let me first very briefly explain how I got to be involved in this story here. My publisher is a very nice lady called Harriet. She publishes my novels in Holland. She took a trip to Iceland. And she was driving through the middle of nowhere, and by the way, I find it's very easy to find yourself in the middle of nowhere in Iceland. She was driving through the middle of nowhere, she got a phone call from a friend in Holland, a lady she knew. So she drove up to a little parking space, and this lady says to her, I heard you're in Iceland, that's great. And as a joke, she said to her, my daughter works there as a tour guide. She drives the tour bus. So if you see her, say hello. However, that very moment, Harriet saw a bus drive up the parking spot. And there was a lady behind the wheel. So she went to this lady and says, are you Petra? And this girl says, yes. I have your mom on the phone. So imagine driving, bus again through the middle of nowhere. Some lady comes up and says, oh, your mom says hi. Right, so anyway, they became good friends. They talked a lot. And eventually, Petra said to her, you should really read this book. It's about a local piece of history. And it's just been translated into English by Adam and Carl. And it's called The Travels of Oliver Ailson. Now, Harriet read the book, liked it, asked me to make the Dutch translation, which I did, and it resulted in this very beautiful Dutch edition of this marvelous story. For Dutch people, there are 2 points of interest in this story. One of them is, of course, that Oliver Ailson, on his way back to Iceland, visited Holland briefly and very briefly describes the country from the perspective of an Icelander at that time. It's very important. There's another aspect to that story, one that is rather more shocking, something that I didn't know and that most Dutch people don't know either. It was shocking enough to be an Icelander on this island in 1627. I see a bunch of pirates from Arabia sail into the harbor. But what was even more shocking, at least to me, is that it's fairly certain now that these Muslims were being led by Dutch pirates, Dutch corsair captains. How the hell is that possible? Well, to answer that question, we have to get back to the Dutch War of Independence, better known as the 80 Years' War, which is, I think it started in 1568 or something like that. And basically, it was the provinces of what is now Holland, Belgium, and Luxembourg against Spain. And well, there were a lot of geopolitical reasons why we started the war against Spain, but basically nobody likes to be occupied by a foreign power. And also, the Spanish had the Spanish Inquisition, and that didn't go down well in Holland, and they imposed heavy taxes. So what started out as a revolt against the Spanish oppressors became a full-scale war over time. And one of the key figures, by the way, of the war against the Spaniards was a man called William of Orange. I don't know if you've ever heard of him. Also named William the Silent, but mostly known as William of Orange. And he is now the ancestor of our royal house. Our present king is a relative, essentially, of William of Orange. And William of Orange, incidentally, is also the reason why we all wear orange to football games. Anyway, we eventually won the war. It's just that it took us 80 years to do so. Now, during the 80 Years' War, a lot of fighting was going on at the sea. Ships attacking each other. And if the Dutch didn't already have enough trouble fighting the Spaniards, they also had to go with pirates, sometimes Dutch pirates attacking their own ships. So at some point, someone had a great idea. He said, what if we make those Dutch pirates work for us? We give them a permission slip, essentially, what is called a letter of marque, what the Dutch call a privateer letter. And they make pirates into privateers. And the only difference between a pirate and a privateer is that a privateer has the permission of its country of origin to loot other ships as long as it's enemy ships. So they basically said, you go ahead and attack ships as long as it's Spanish enemies. So to the privateers, this was great. They now had a get out of jail free card, right? They could go on with their piracy, go on looting, plundering, raping, and so on. But they had the permission to do so. So this worked out fine for a couple of years, but then there was a problem. There was a temporal ceasefire between Holland and Spain, which is called the 12-year truce. So for 12 years, there was, well, no war between the Dutch provinces and the King of Spain. So Holland said to these pirates, okay, you'll have to stop now. And surprisingly, the pirates didn't like that very much. They wanted to keep being a pirate and do what they do. But they couldn't, or they would be arrested. So some of them went back to land or got other jobs, but a few die-hard pirate captains went to look for other harbors and other places to continue being a pirate. Mm-hmm. And they found these harbors at what was known as the Barbary Coast, the north coast of Africa. Now, the north coast of Africa had the Barbary corsairs. There were Muslim pirates already there. But they didn't know much about sailing or shipbuilding. So they had been basically stuck in the Mediterranean They had these old ships that you had to row to get somewhere, right? But the Dutch were master shipbuilders. They knew how to build ships and how to steer them. So basically they went to the Muslims and said, I am so-and-so from Holland, I have a great deal for you. I teach you how to build ships and how to steer them, and we'll go looting countries together. And the Muslims said, sure, that's great. So that's basically what happened. The Dutch taught the Muslims how to build sailing ships that allowed them to leave the Mediterranean, go out on the sea, and reach faraway places like Ireland and Iceland. So essentially, that's how they got there. And essentially, it makes it all of this, our fault. So,
Can we blame you?
my government sent me here today to finally issue an official apology to Iceland. Anyway, that's basically the story. I've been told to keep it brief. Adam, my good friend, has some more information on who these pirates were specifically. We know who these guys were. There's still a lot of information about them. And they were beautifully colorful people. And they had this, they lived on the edge of, they were outlaws, but they were also businessmen. They were also governors. They were given important jobs on the mainland. They even became like official, ambassadors for Holland. So this was a very strange time, and Mats already said, we tend to think of slavery as white people enslaving black people, and for the most part, that's what it is. But this was a time when white people actively helped, colored people to get white slaves. And that just shows how massively complex and how beautifully complex this whole piece of history is. And when this book came out, it was well received, but most of all, it exposed a bit of history that very few Dutch people know about. And it would be hugely interesting to reconnect and go back into history and, bring it alive again. Because history thrives on the complexity of it, on all the little nuances. And I think we would do well to dive into this and make many people know about this wonderful story. Thank you very much.
As Joris said, we actually know who the Corsair captains were who organized and led the raids here in Iceland. It's commonly thought that there was one raid. It is, of course, known as the Tyrkjaránið, the Turkish raid. In fact, there were two. Two separate raids led by two separate Corsair captains, both of whom were Dutch.
Yeah.
The man who led the raid on Salé, that was the first raid in June, at the end of June. A single ship, one ship, arrived at Grindavik early in the morning of a June day, and they pillaged Grindavik, sailed around the Reykjanes Peninsula, unsuccessfully attacked Bessastaðir, went into the waters up past Snæfellsnes, and attacked a few English fishing boats. The English were there fishing for cod, and then sailed back to Salé. And that was the first attack. The second attack consisted of first 2 and then 3 ships. And they attacked the east fjords first, Djúpivogur, and the fjords around there, and then they sailed along the south coast and attacked here. And this happened in July. They were in Icelandic waters for several weeks. The Salé corsairs were only in Icelandic waters for about a week. The Algerian corsairs, who attacked the East Fjords and here, had a much more successful expedition. They went home with close to 400 people. The Salé corsairs were much less successful. They might have taken anywhere from 50 to 60, perhaps. It's difficult to tell. And it would be Icelanders, Danes, and English fishermen. So two entirely separate raids. And we know who the corsair captains were. The leader of the Salé raid was a man called Jan Jansson van Harlem. He was one of these Dutch privateers. He wound up in Algiers and took a Muslim name, Murad. Murad is actually Turkish, and it means ambition, desire, goal, achievement. And he was known as Murad Reis, and Reis means captain. So calling yourself Murad Reis is like calling yourself Captain Ambition. It was quite a common name. So Murad Reis led the Salé corsairs, and a man named Murad Flamenco, same name, spelled differently, pronounced slightly differently. Flamenco means Flemish, Dutch. He was from Antwerp, and he led the Algiers corsairs. We know a lot about Murad Reis's life. He started life as a Dutch privateer, licensed, legal, but according to early Dutch sources, he, and the quote is, he wildly exceeded the terms of his commission. And instead of just attacking Spanish ships, he attacked everybody. And it's not clear whether he did this before or after the 12 Years' Truce, but it looks like once a pirate, always a pirate. And he couldn't resist, and they found an English ship or a French ship or whatever, and he just couldn't resist attacking them. So he ended up as a pirate. And for a while he operated out of La Rochelle on the western coast of France. And then he wound up in Lanzarote, one of the Canary Islands. How he wound up there is not certain. He might have been shipwrecked. One version of the story has it that he was working out of La Rochelle and he was on a ship that was shipwrecked on Lanzarote. And in the summer of 1618, that's the first date we have for him. It's a clear date. Summer of 1618, this massive corsair attack from Algiers happens on Lanzarote with 3,000 men and 15 ships, just this giant attack. And among the people taken is Jan Jansson van Harlem. Now, whether or not he was actually taken as a captive or whether he decided just to join the corsairs is not clear. The leader of that massive corsair expedition was another Dutch renegade named Ivan de Wienboer, Ivan the peat farmer. His Muslim name was Suleiman Reis. And he had a reputation for liking to crew his ships with fellow Dutchmen. So it's possible that Jan just joined forces with him. There is a warrant for his arrest from the Canary Island chapter of the Spanish Inquisition. And the Spanish Inquisition was after him because, they said, he had been known to live on Lanzarote as a Catholic. And he'd been captured by the corsairs, taken to Algiers, and immediately converted to Islam. And for that sin, the warrant was issued for his arrest anywhere in the known world. Bring him back here so we can burn him at the stake. They never got him, of course. He showed up in Algiers and almost immediately became a corsair. And within a year was a corsair captain, which sort of gives credence to the idea that he joined them willingly and either he and Suleiman Reis knew each other personally or by reputation or something, because he was operating as a captain. First as a lieutenant in Suleiman Reis's fleet, and then as a captain in his own right. And he stayed in Algiers until the early 1620s, when Suleiman Reis died in a naval battle just outside Cartagena on the Mediterranean coast of Spain. He had his leg blown off with a cannonball while he was standing on deck giving orders, and quickly died of shock and blood loss. And with him gone, the corsairs lost cohesion in the ships they were attacking, who had just come in from Newfoundland, where they'd been fishing for cod. They were managed to escape and get into the harbor of Cartagena. At which point, Murad Reis left Algiers and went to Saleh, on the west coast of Morocco. And he operated out of Saleh for several years and eventually became Admiral of Saleh. Although Admiral is maybe the wrong word. It wasn't a naval title. He was the harbor master. He oversaw taxes and duty, and he signed the letters of marque, because the Saleh corsairs were in fact privateers, as the Algiers corsairs were. The Dutch were able just to slide right into the operation in North Africa, because it was essentially the same operation. The North African city-states like Algiers and Tripoli and Tunis and Saleh issued letters of marque to their privateers, to the corsairs, and they went out and attacked enemy shipping and brought in the loot and sold it. The difference between European and North African privateers is that the Europeans just dealt with loot, with goods, and the North Africans dealt with loot and people. So Murad Reis became Admiral of Saleh, the harbor master of Saleh, issued the letters of marque, oversaw the collection of customs duties and taxes, and was part of the government of Saleh, and became a very wealthy and influential man. In the spring, in May of 1627, Saleh declared its independence from the Sultan of Morocco. It became an independent city. Exactly at this point, the English, who were getting fed up with being attacked all the time by the Saleh corsairs in the English Channel, had signed a treaty with Saleh, a peace treaty, saying, we're not going to attack each other anymore, you don't attack our ships, we don't attack yours, and you're welcome to sail into our harbor anytime. This was great in the long run. Saleh had just declared its independence, it needed allies, England was going to be a good ally. The problem was that Murad Reis couldn't attack English ships in the English Channel anymore. Something the Saleh corsairs had been doing for years. They would take 1,000 people a year doing that. So we had to go somewhere. And if you couldn't go to the Channel, you could maybe go into the Mediterranean, but there were other complications there with other treaties. The whole thing was complicated and messy, and it looked like it was going to be a bad summer to be a corsair, until somebody got the idea of going to Iceland. The story in Tyrkjaránið saga is that it was a bet. And whatever the source of it was, they got the idea of going to Iceland. So it was Murad Reis, who was now Admiral of Saleh, and this other guy, Murad Flamenco. They did the attack, we all know what happened. Murad Reis came back to Saleh, not to Algiers. It's often thought that he went back to Algiers. He did not. He went back to Saleh and continued to be Admiral in Saleh for another 4 years. And then in the summer of 1631, he was up in the English Channel. He went back. The peace treaty with England fell through because the English king decided that the Saleh people were rebels against their rightful monarch, and he refused to have any dealings with rebels. So he did not honor the treaty. So the Saleh corsairs went back to attacking English shipping in the English Channel. And Murad Reis organized an attack on Baltimore on the south coast of Ireland, took over 100 captives, and brought them back to sell them. But he didn't go to Saleh. At this point, Saleh was stuck in a civil war. Saleh is a city on the south bank of a river. There's another city on the north bank. The city on the north bank has a much longer history. In those days, it was a very pious, serious city, strongly disapproved of what Saleh was doing, the pirate capital. And they were in the middle of an actual war. And the north bank city had placed cannons to command the harbor. So any ship, any pirate ship that tried to sail into the harbor, they just blow it out of the water. So Murad Reis couldn't bring his captives back to Saleh. He brought them back to Algiers instead and sold them in Algiers, which is one of the sources of the story that he was based in Algiers. He wasn't, not according to the documents. He just went to Saleh to sell his captives because, went to Algiers to sell his captives because Saleh was temporarily closed because of the this civil war. He then returned to Morocco, but at this point, he gave up corsairing entirely. By this time, he was probably in his 60s. Good age to give up corsairing. And he went to a place called Safi, which is just south of Saleh, and arranged with the Moroccan Sultan to become governor of a small port town called Uwalidia. And the Sultan said, okay, if you do this, I'll give you a new wife, and I'll give you a whole garrison to command, and a fortress of your own. You just have to hold it for me. So and that's what he did. That's how he spent the rest of his life, as a governor and as an elder statesman. When the Dutch showed up and wanted to try and connect with the Moroccan Sultan, they went through Murad Reis. He was their guy. And in fact, the last we know of him, in 1641, his daughter Elizabeth comes visiting him from the Netherlands, because at one point he was married and had children in the Netherlands before he left on his new career as a barber corsair. And his grown-up daughter came to visit him. And she was there as part of an expedition. A Dutch ambassador was coming to visit the Moroccan Sultan to sort out treaty relationships and try and free some Dutch captives. And the first person he went to was Murad Reis, because he was the guy. He knew the Sultan. He could ease the way. And they pulled into the harbor at Safi, and Murad Reis rode down on horseback from Uwalidia down the coast. And there's this wonderful description of him. He was rowed out to the ship where his daughter and the Moroccan and the Dutch ambassador were waiting. And the description is, he was rowed out on a boat, seated in state, surrounded by silk cushions and his servants. This is a successful man. He was a ruthless pirate. He was a trafficker in human beings. There is, in fact, one document that says he tortured somebody to death in order to find out whether there was any treasure on the ship. But he didn't meet what you would think of as his just deserts. He wound up as this rich, successful, influential governor. Sort of like a classic politician, right? And then we don't know how he died. There's one book in Dutch that claims he had a nasty ending, but that's probably wishful thinking. These guys, they were amazing. They were businessmen, but they were utterly heartless businessmen. They arrived in Iceland not because they were crazy pirates, and not because they were Muslim fanatics, because they were businessmen. They wanted to get as much money and as many human beings as possible to bring them back and sell them at the highest profit possible. And a lot of these guys were the equivalent of what today we would call millionaires. Mind you, a lot of them died at sea, or were captured, or died of the plague. And most corsair captains didn't lead long lives. But those who did, and who prospered, wound up like Murad Reis, as successful, wealthy elder statesmen. The other corsair captain, Murat Flamenco, has a different story. We know less about him. He's, in general, exactly the same kind of character. He's an ex-Dutch privateer from Antwerp instead of Haarlem. He had a career as a privateer at some point, moved on, became a pirate, went to North Africa, joined the Barbary Corsairs there, and became a Barbary Corsair captain. In the year 1625-26, that winter, there was a Dutch emissary, a guy called Cornelis Pijnacker, in Algiers. And one of the things he did while he was there is compile a list of the foremost corsair captains in Algiers, about close to 60 of them. Half of them were European, renegades. Renegades were Europeans who had converted from Christianity to Islam. Half of those nearly 60 corsair captains, the foremost, right, or best ones, were European. And half of those European ones were Dutch. And amongst the Dutch corsair captains mentioned is Murat Flamenco from Antwerp. And in the Icelandic documents, in Tyrkjaránið saga, he's mentioned as Morad Flaming. Same name, clearly the same name. He's mentioned several times that way. And in the Icelandic documents, it said that he tried to come back to Iceland for further attacks because he had a spectacularly successful expedition. 3 ships coming back with nearly 400 captives. That's hugely successful. So he wanted to come back. And in fact, we have a letter from Jon Jonsson, who was one of the people from Youngjöðustaður farm in the Grindavik area who'd been captured by the Salé Corsairs. He wrote a letter in which he mentions that Murat Flamenco had tried to come back to Iceland for a further attack, and he put together a fleet of 5 ships, and he sailed up through that same route you saw on the map here, out the Strait of Gibraltar and up the Atlantic coast of Spain, Portugal, France, through the English Channel, out past Ireland, and then up past the Faroes into Iceland. And he only got as far as the English Channel because he captured an English ship there that was full of treasure, and so he didn't need to go any further, he just turned back. So he tried several times. And you'd think a man who is that famous, who's on the list of the best, the most successful Corsair captains in Algiers at this time, would be a well-known name, like Murat Reis is. Except for one thing. The life of a Corsair captain is, of course, risky. And what happened to Murat Flamenco was that he moved from Algiers to Tripoli. And almost immediately he went off on an expedition and was captured by the Knights of Malta, the Knights Hospitaller. The island of Malta is located just north of Tripoli. And the Knights of Malta, the Knights Hospitaller, had Mediterranean galleys, these long oared galleys rowed by slaves. They were big galleys. They were formidable weapons of war, these galleys. And they patrolled the waters in the eastern Mediterranean and attacked Muslim shipping. And Murat Flamenco was attacked by one of these Maltese galleys and taken captive. And that ended his career. And we know this because there's a passage in a book called Histoire de Barbarie, written by a guy called Pierre Dom, written in the 1640s. Pierre Dom was there are these religious organizations who were put together specifically for the ransoming of slaves, the Mercedarians and the Trinitarians. He was a Trinitarian friar in Algiers trying to ransom French captives. Failed in that mission. But he came back to France and ended up writing this huge book about Barbary Corsairs. And there's a passage in that book where he's talking about Tripoli. And he says, the valiant Knights Hospitaller, because from French point of view, they are valiant knights defending the seas. The valiant knights defend the seas so well that they keep the Tripoli pirates in check. Without them, these pirates would do terrible damage. But the knights are so successful that not only do they keep them in check, but they also capture some of the most important captains. Take, for example, Murat Flamenco, whom Pierre Dom calls Murat Flamand, and it's clearly the same name, who, despite being one of the most famous pirates in the Mediterranean, and despite all his cleverness, was taken captive by the Knights of Malta. And Pierre Dom was in North Africa in 1634. So this happened about that time. And that's the end of Murat Flamenco's career. This happens to a lot of Corsair captains. They end up being wildly successful and then suddenly, that's it. So we know these two men. Both Dutch renegades, as Joris was saying, the Dutch were the foremost sailors of the time. They had the best ships, the best sailors. They were we're all familiar with the American Revolution. And the Americans liked to boast that they're the first democracy and the first republic, and theirs was the important revolution. In fact, the Dutch were the first democracy and the first republic and the first important revolution 200 years before. And the whole complexity of that Dutch revolution created these Dutch corsairs who were ruthless men who had been trained 20 years of warfare against the Spanish, 2 generations. And they were just naturally born pirates. There's one document that I read that said people were terrified of the Dutch sailors because they could see their white teeth flashing through their beards when they grinned like the fangs of animals.
Not exactly the same.
So we know who these guys are. The ordinary story is that there was one raid, and it was led by Murat Reis, and that was it. But in fact, the documents tell a different, far more interesting, far more complex story. That there were these 2 Dutch renegades, 2 entirely different raids. One in the southwest, and one in the southeast, and here in Himay. And that it was, like all events in history, this complex human event, full of all sorts of interesting stories, all sorts of background stuff. The moral of this story, finally, is go to the documents. If you're going to talk about history, read the original documents. Because the original documents tell the story. And those original documents always tell the best story. They always have the best details. They always tell the best. So, we tried to get, Carl and I, when we did these books, we tried to go to the documents to tell the story. It's the only thing we do. Anybody have any questions? I think now's our one chance to ask questions on anything, all right? We have a few minutes.
Yeah, just short questions now, because after the music, we will have question and answers. So just short questions if you have on
Any questions about the pirate captain?
Yeah, and then we have, general for all of us after the music.
Okay, looks like we do not have any questions about the pirate captains.
Well, okay, we'll have the music and we'll think about it.
Good, okay.
Just a minute.
Dear friends, we're going to do a ring dance from Bulgaria with an Icelandic twist. thank you. And this was Krummi Krunkaruti from my second album. I just mentioned before that I released a trilogy of Icelandic folk songs where I've taken them on a journey to the Eastern world. And the first album was played with some legendary Turkish musicians from Istanbul, with Göksel Baktagir, Yurdal Bokshan, and many other names you probably don't know, but they're like legends around these parts. And the second album I made with Bulgarian musicians from the Trachea ensemble from Plovdiv in South Bulgaria. And the last album of the trilogy is called Persian Path, which I made with people from Iran. I went to Iran in 2018. I met up with amazing oud player called Hamid Kansai, and they have this amazing tradition of music which is a little bit different from the Arabic style and the Turkish style. So in the Middle East they have kind of three main styles, and they have preserved their style in a different way. And also with these instrument and the tradition of the music, they have different microtones and a little bit different rhythms and different influence throughout the years. Like in Iran, they have more American influence than you could imagine. Before the revolution, 1978 or 1979, they were of course very connected to the States, so they know a lot about the American or Western tradition of music. So it was very intriguing or very nice to be able to go there and meet people. It's a magical place to be in Iran, and I can tell you many stories from my trip. I was there alone, and when I arrived at the airport, you only have because Western cards, credit cards or debit cards, they don't work there. So you have to bring cash. So at the airport, I had $200, and I got like a mountain of dinars. So I took it and put it in my pocket, and then I took a taxi, and I saw the taxi meter was going up, like, and I think, wow, how much is this going to be? And it was like 300,000 dinars, after 10 minutes. And I asked the taxi driver, how much is it going to be to Tehran? And he said, 750,000 dinars. And I started counting what I had, and it was like 14 million. So, and this is my offspring or my biggest work today. It's like the trilogy in a vinyl version, and I'm extremely proud of this. The first, people tell me that this is all of the CDs together in one vinyl version. And it's first, people tell me it's the first trilogy of vinyl trilogy in Icelandic music history. And I just take it in and say thank you. So and we're gonna do, and if somebody wants a copy, I can, I'd be happy to, send somebody a copy if you like. So we're going to end this up with like the probably most famous Icelandic folk song. It's called Sofðu unga ástin mín. And on the album, it's sung by the wonderful Sigríður Thorlacius, and she sings vocals on all of the albums, and also Egill Ólafsson and some people from Middle East. Yurdal sings on one of the songs, and wonderful singer from Iran called Samin Gorbani sings some Persian Path. So it's a lot of different flavors of music on these three albums. And the folk song is always within, but I composed many parts, so it's not your usual version of these songs. So we're going to finish it up with Sofðu ástin mín with these great gentlemen. Give it up for Þorgrímur Jónsson and Erik Quick. So, yeah.
skulum hérna bara í lokin minna á það að þessar bækur hérna eru til sölu, Stolen Lives og svo Tyrkjaránið hans Mats. En við skulum aðeins opna fyrir spurningar og við kannski bara byrja. I'd like to ask you, Mats,
Okay.
your main person, Orman, is he based on a real person or is he a fiction?
He's a fictional character.
Absolutely, not.
No, yes,
Yeah.
all based on that he was, I know that there were some people watching. So he was one of the survivors.
Yeah.
And then then he became then he suffered from this mental, obviously, that he saw this butchering of his children and they took away his wife and his daughter. And then he dreamed this, but he's fictional character, yes. So it's only Olafur and Morel that are historical characters.
And just one question for me. I mean, it is difficult to publish these old texts in Icelandic, but how is it to publish them in a foreign language like yours in your country? I mean, how is it in Netherlands? I mean, is there a market for this, or is there a growing interest in this, or understanding of this part of history?
You mean, is there a growing interest in Holland for this particular story?
Yeah.
Yes, because it's not just a boring historical event. It's a very human, traumatic story that still resonates today. And particularly because it involves Dutchmen, which is interesting, but I think you have a beautiful baggage story here that you should keep alive, definitely.
Just my final question to you, Adam. I mean, how is it possible to have an interest in the Turkish trade for such a long time, year after year after year, come here again and again? Tell us a little bit about your blog. Just how did you fall involved, and how is it to keep the flame? How do you do it?
It takes no effort. I've always found the subject so fascinating. It connects to so many different areas that it's one of those things, you know, if you ask somebody, why do you love your wife? How did you fall in love with your wife? The answer often is, I don't know, I just adore her. I didn't choose to adore her, it just worked out. And it's a similar sort of thing. I didn't actually choose to become involved with the Tyrkjaránið, but I ended up discovering it to be a continuing source of fascination. It's an amazingly complicated and very interesting story. I'd just like to add one thing to the comment about publishing in other countries. Carl and I finished a French translation. And we have a publisher in Morocco who it looks like is going to publish that. And their reason for publishing is that it connects, this event in Iceland connects to their history. Because Murat Reis came back to Saleh and saw the captives in Saleh. And so this is something that they know about. They know the Moroccan side of the event. But they don't know any details at all about what happened in Iceland. And so there's a real interest in Morocco, particularly among the academic community and people who are sort of well-read and educated and interested in Moroccan history. There's a real interest in what happened. They don't know the story. So they're very curious. And so that when we sent them the French manuscript, they immediately were interested.
Well, I would like to thank you for coming and sharing this with us. Einhverjar svona loka spurningar, ef ekki þá ætla ég þér ekki síðast orðið, Karl?
Jú.
Ef þér bara að loka þessari dagskrá, þá morgun.
Já, ég vil bara byrja því að þakka Kára og Helgu og þeirra fólki hérna fyrir að bjóða okkur. Við Adam komum voru hérna bara orðið jafnvel 2 ári, hvers skipti sem við komum með nýja bók, þá við boðum komið hingað og kynna bækurnar. Talandi Adam og hans dugna, ég hef ekki orðið við að þýða fyrran, skjöl, heimildir. Það eru 4 bækur á þessu ári sem við erum búin að vinna. Stolen Lives kom út í sumar. Við erum búin að setja saman Stolen Lives og Northern Captives, það er að segja Bandaríkjabókina og Vestmannaeyjabókina, stytta hann í 99.000 orð, þannig að við hugsum að gefa hana út erlendis bara í einu bindi. Síðan erum við búin að þýða og ganga frá handritun á frönsku útgáfunni sem ég gleymdi að minnast á. Nú verður það gefin út líklega í Marokko, í Casablanca. Og síðan það núna þessi bók fyrir Cornell háskóla, það er að segja Tyrkjaránið saga Björns Garsó. Ég hef aldrei kynnst manni sem að vinnur frá morgni til kvölds eins og Adam á fullu. Ég vona að þetta fara að verða búið. Ég vil bara þakka ykkur kærlega fyrir að bjóða okkur hingað og þessi frábæra tónlist sem ég bara vissi ekki að hún verið til. Svona útgáfa af íslenskum þjóðlögum, það er frábært. Og bara ykkur sem komið hingað. Mér langar til að minnast á eina hugmynd sem ég kom með hérna í sumar að þið vitið að út allt land það er búið að bæði lítil sveitarfélög, stór sveitarfélög, þau hafa alls konar stofur. Það er til á Kirkjubæjarklaustri Kjarvalsstofa, Kjarvalsstofa var það í nokkur ár og eitthvað tengt Errósafni líka og Djúpavogi, þar er safn og svona hingað og þangað. Mig langar til að sjá í framtíðinni, bara í nánustu framtíð, þá hef ég gjarnan viljað sjá hér Ólafsstofu. Einhvers konar svona smá stofnun eða stærri stofnun sem væri tengd þessu 1627 sögursetri eða safninu hér til minningar sér Ólaf Eiríksson. Það er líka eitt. Ég verð að minnast á það í gær þegar við Adam fórum hérna í ferjuna. Þá vorum við myndir á það að við erum báðir orðnir eldri borgarar. Engum afslátt. En það þýðir, við erum búin að vera í þessu 25 ára. Við erum orðnir eldri borgarar. Það kemur að því að við förum að hætta þessu. En sérstaklega Adam og reyndar ég líka, við erum í tengslum við fræðimenn víða heim. Það verður einhver að taka við okkar kefli. Og ég held að það væri best að það yrði gert hér í Vestmannaeyjum. Þannig að þetta detti ekki niður á þessi tengsl sem Adam hefur og reyndar ég líka. Við fræðimenn, allar þessar útgáfur sem í gangi og allir þessi fræðastarfsemi, ég held hún eigi best heima hér. Ekki að lokast inn í Háskóla Íslands sem hefur svona smá fílabeinsturns ímyndar á sér, sko. Og ég var einmitt að hugsa það í morgun að ég á fulla möppu ljósrit á greinum þessar bækur sem við höfum verið að vinna alls konar utan úr heimi, jafnvel arabísku. Adam skrifaði grein á frönsku, já, arabískt tímari. Við erum svona að safna þessu saman og afhenda síðan Kára ljósrit af þessu. Og eins lofaði Kára því í dag að fara að bara koma til hans bókum sem ég á sem að snerta Tyrkjaránið því að ég held að þetta eigi best heima hérna. Ég er ekkert að lofa ykkur því að ég ætla að fara að hætta eða deyja eða eitthvað. En það kemur að því eftir 25-30 ára starf í þessu, verandi orðin eldri borgari, það kemur að því. Og ég vona að svo getur orðið. En ég vil bara aftur þakka kærlega fyrir þessar höfðinglegu móttökur sem við fáum hérna og hérna sem getur ekki verið á betri kosi. Nú fleira hef ég ekki að segja. Ég veit að ég tala líka fyrir mun þegar hérna þykja.
Já, við þökkum.